Many decades ago, my countryman Gandhi was asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he famously replied, "I think it would be a good idea." Now, this is Gandhi being kind of pungently witty in a way that he isn't known for being. But what Gandhi's saying is really two things. One is he's saying that the Western powers under colonialism did not live up to their own standards. And in this, I think he had a good point. But the other thing is he's genuinely saying that our complaint with the West is not that that we have Western principles that are being brought to India. Our complaint is that this is not being done in a fair or adequate way. We want Western principles, Gandhi seems to be saying. But on the other hand, we want them to be brought to India in a kind of humane and decent way, a way consistent with Western principles themselves. Now, how far this way of thinking is from sort of the modern left. And I say this because when Queen Elizabeth died, you've got all these people denouncing British colonialism. Queen is not exactly a symbol of British colonialism, but I suppose just to the degree that she represents the monarchy, she represents the late stage of British colonialism. By the way, British colonialism began to unwind really after World War I. It had unwound itself largely by the 1950s, when countries like Ghana and India, of course, in the 1940s, got its independence. And then we've been living since then in the post-colonial era. But several years ago, I wrote an article. It was initially published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, subsequently in the San Francisco Chronicle. It was called Two Cheers for Colonialism. And I kind of stole the title from Irving Kristol, who once wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. And it's significantly two cheers and not three, because I can see that the motives of the colonialists were to sort of take advantage of the countries that they subdued and ruled. I'm not claiming that colonialism to that degree was benign in its motive. But what I am claiming is that colonialism, although it was harsh for some of the people, or many of the people who lived under it, nevertheless proved beneficial for its descendants. Now, today, if you go around India, in the universities, you're going to find a few people who are basically, similar to here. They've been sort of brainwashed into this kind of reflexive, everything Western is bad, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go, all this kind of nonsense. But the typical Indian does not feel this way. The typical Indian today, very different than the typical Indian of my youth, basically recognizes that India is in many ways better off because of colonialism. That if India had never had, let's say India had not had any Western influence at all until the 20th century, India would be a latecomer to Western technology. India would be a latecomer to principles of human dignity, human rights, separation of powers, checks and balances, Western courts of law. India has all that. The English language, the best writers in the world today come not from Britain per se, but they often come from the far-flung colonies of Great Britain, people who are natives, people who come from places like Trinidad and places like India, who have learned the English language in a sense as one of the legacies of colonialism. And of course, people were, what about all the things that the British stole from India? Yeah, the British took raw materials from India, notably to feed the textile mills of Manchester and so on. But let's remember that it's not the British who made these countries poor. Many of these countries have been poor since time immemorial. Their poverty is really the result of not having had a Renaissance or a Reformation or an Enlightenment or a scientific revolution or a technological revolution. So what happened is that the British were the vehicles. They were the transmission belt. Colonialism was the unintentional transmission belt that brought those institutions, not just to India, but sort of took them to the far-flung world. And many countries around the world, think of places like Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong is now, of course, under Chinese subjugation, but Hong Kong before that. Think, for example, of Singapore. Think about the so-called Asian tigers that have made dramatic economic progress. India is now making dramatic progress in technology. And all I'm saying is that all of this is in part the legacy of Western civilization and the legacy of British colonialism, reluctant though some people may be to admit it.